Some of you may have loved ones who are close to death. And there may be some of you may be caregivers for people who are facing death. So whatever it is that brought you here, I want to just say a few things about various Buddhist approaches to meeting death. And I would say meeting death face to face or with some degree of openness. And that isn't easy in our culture. We tend to shy away. There's a lot of what's called denial of death. But I think I would say most, and you know, there are different schools of Buddhism, and particularly there are differences in what Buddhists think about what happens after death. But in terms of meeting death, I think the basic understanding is death is a natural part of life. We're all going to die. We don't know when. And knowing that, being aware of that day to day can make our lives feel very precious, you know, that each day makes a difference. What we do, how we set our priorities, our intentions, what we feel is most important in our lives can help us live our lives fully every day, which is a way of preparing for death, so that when we get to the end, when we don't know when that is, we will feel, or we can feel, that we that we have, I'll just put it in the positive, that we have shared our thoughts and feelings with people who are close to us, who we love, that we've done some of the things that we feel are important to do, and that isn't so much unfinished business. Although, you know, as I say, we don't know when that moment will come, and sometimes it comes with no warning at all. Sometimes we have time to prepare for it. But I think that one of the ideas is to start preparing now. Why wait? And there are 5 remembrances by Thich Nhat Hanh, a Vietnamese Buddhist teacher, who this is his version of a very old teaching, the 5 remembrances, and I'll share them and see if you can listen, let them in, and see how they resonate with you. I am of the nature to grow old. There is no way to escape growing old. I am of the nature to have ill health. There is no way to escape ill health. I am of the nature to die. There is no way to escape death. All that is dear to me and everyone I love are of the nature to change. There is no way to escape being separated from them. My actions are my only true belongings. I cannot escape the consequences of my actions. My actions are the ground upon which I stand. So I think what that points to, and if we are, you know, you might say fortunate enough to grow old, or some people may think it's unfortunate to grow old, but if you do live into your whatever decades you think of as old, this is of our nature. We can't avoid it unless we die young, and the same with ill health and death. We can't escape them. These were some of the awarenesses that led the Buddha to leave the wealthy home in which he grew up, and decide to enter into a spiritual quest. Those awarenesses. Can we live our lives fully up until the moment of our death? And I just want to say a few words about some Buddhist notions about what happens after death. And also to mention we have copies of the 5 remembrances, so I'll put them on the resource table. You can take them home. You know, some people put these up on their walls, on their altars, on their desks, and look at these every day or learn them by heart because they help us, I think, appreciate the preciousness of life. So in terms of what happens after we die, I think the Tibetan Buddhists in particular, and you may have something to say about this, Lapsang, but the Dalai Lama talks about reincarnation, that after we die, we're reborn, and there is a passage between the end of one life and the beginning of the next, when our spirit may be in what's called the bardo, and there are practices that we can do as we're dying that may help us be reborn in a favorable situation. And then there are other beliefs, like Thich Nhat Hanh wrote a book called No Death, No Fear, and he talks about the image of each of us being like a wave in the ocean, and that when we die we become part of the ocean. There's a sense that, you know, each of us has an individual existence, but we are also on another level, we're totally interconnected with all beings, past, present, and future. So that idea of when we die, there is something that continues, that becomes part of this. I'm not sure even how to describe it, but it's a way of knowing there's something that goes on, that we merge with all of existence. And then there's a Zen story that I love, because my own personal feeling about death is I don't know what happens after death. And I'm just curious, but I don't know. And there was a story about a teacher who took one of his disciples. This was a Chinese Buddhist story. This happened sometime in the 9th or 10th century. And it's called Dao Wu's Condolence Call. Dao Wu is the teacher, and he took his student with him to visit the home of someone who had died. And the student knocked on the coffin and said, "Teacher, alive or dead?" And the teacher said, "Won't say." And the student seemed quite agitated and knocked again. "Teacher, alive or dead?" Teacher said, "No, I won't say." And then they left, made the condolence call, and on their way back to the monastery, the student said, really upset, "Teacher, alive or dead, tell me. If you don't tell me, I'll hit you." And the teacher said, "Won't say." Student hit the teacher. The teacher said, "I think you better not go back to the monastery, because the head monk is not going to be very happy with this, that you hit me." And so what is that story about? Why did the teacher refuse to say? And later on, this monk was in a town where he heard someone chanting. And the person was chanting a chapter of the Lotus Sutra, which is about the qualities of Kuan Yin. Kuan Yin is we call a bodhisattva, an awakening being that embodies compassion. And when the student heard the words of the Lotus Sutra, he realized the great compassion of his teacher in not telling him. So that there's some way in which, you know, whether the teacher didn't say because he wanted the student to find out for himself, that's my interpretation of it, and to arrive at his own understanding of what happens, alive or dead. Because most of us, you know, some people have near-death experiences and come back and have some story about what they experienced, but most of us really don't know. We may have beliefs about what happens after we die. So I think that keeping an open mind can be very helpful. And I know that some beliefs about what happens after death can be comforting to people. So for those who believe in heaven, I'm not sure believing in hell is very comforting. I think it isn't comforting, but I didn't grow up with that kind of belief system. So I think being curious about what death is all about, and nowadays, there is more. I think there's growing interest in death. There's an international movement of death cafes. Has anyone here been to a death cafe? So one person has. So people get together and they talk about death. There are refreshments and usually a small group, and there are some guidelines about what to talk about, what to avoid talking about, and it's not a time to make practical arrangements, or it's more about what are people's ideas about death. And there's, in addition to palliative care and hospice and people who work in those fields and chaplains, there's a new field of a death doula, kind of like there are birth doulas, recognizing that death is a passage, just as birth is, and it deserves the same kind of care and attention and tenderness as birth does. So I think I will end my comments there, and over to you, Mushim. Thank you.
Thank you, Tova. So obviously this is a large topic, and we're just opening up certain things that we hope may be of interest. So, to be more present and comfortable with our own death, I think it's helpful to find ways to be with death itself in supported and more comfortable than not ways. And that's probably going to be a little bit different for all of us. We're all different in that way. So find the way that feels good for you. If this is an invitation that resonates with you, again, it's part of the preparation for what Buddhists consider to be inevitable. That which is born or created will, we say, die. And also in the Buddhist understanding, death means transformation from one form to another. We're always going through changes. Some of the transformations are so tiny, we don't even notice it. Like, you have like a hair that's going to fall out, probably several. We're constantly shedding dead skin cells. Parts of our bodies are, if we're healthy enough, are replacing themselves or not. Sometimes then we get that diagnosis of illness that we had dreaded. That can happen. Children die, babies do die. I've been called into situations for sudden infant death syndrome, where the child who was a community member, was 4.5 months old. And that is possible statistically. It happens. So it's really considered to be wise that when we can do so now, how can we be most comfortable with our own death and that of others? How can we understand it more deeply? How can we look at, with support, get support, any fear that we may have, and the ignorance that often surrounds death, so that we feel like, well, okay, I'm at least better prepared than I was before. Once again, on the resource table, you're going to find a lot of things, including some, I photocopied a preparation or a list from my lawyer when I had my will and durable power of attorney done. And this is so that the person who takes care of my affairs after I die will be able to look at this list and say, oh yeah, let's check off, close down the bank accounts, credit cards, just all that very practical aspect. When we feel more prepared, we usually feel more comfortable and at ease, and it breaks it down to smaller and more manageable tasks that we really can do. And one of those tasks might be find support. Find a grief support group through one of the local hospices, look on Craigslist, find support, talk to other people. So there are, I grew up in Ohio in the 1960s in a quasi-rural area, and my folks came from farming backgrounds. My mother was from Hawaii. She worked in the cane fields there, the pineapple fields. My father did come from a farming family. So, and being in Ohio, in the country, you were always seeing dead animals and dead insects, and I mean, just things were dead. And so, and because my family had that kind of farming attitude towards it, we never thought of death as being something that was unusual or abnormal. It might be very sad if it was a pet. And we really recognized that that was part of life. So I grew up in a very Buddhist kind of environment. We don't need to necessarily be afraid or mystify all of this. Of course, we may have mystical beliefs, but this is what happens. We're born, we live for a certain amount of time. Most of us don't know how long we die, and then usually there's cremation or body burial in the earth. And the more familiar we become with this, my Sufi friend who died of a massive heart attack a couple of Januaries ago, Baba Ibrahim Farajage, the provost of Star King School of the Ministry, he was a Sufi imam, and so when he died, his followers had many beautiful parties and celebrated his wedding with what they called the beloved friend. So we can, when we become familiar enough with this, death can become a beloved friend. For myself, this ability to be with my own death and to contemplate it, to meditate upon it, to talk to other folks about it, to deal with it practically, has also, it's also been very valuable for me to write about death. I am a writer, and so this is one of my basic ways of understanding my own experience. And when my father died suddenly in the night of stroke-related causes, when I happened to be visiting him at his house in Virginia, yes, this is my mom's house in Virginia, in 1996, April, it really shocked the whole family. And afterwards, I did two things. I went to a bereavement counselor at a local hospice who was fantastically helpful. And I also started writing about my father's death. And most of what I've written has been published and it's really, really helped me to gain an understanding and more familiarity with the many, many manifestations of the way death appears in our minds. So the advice basically is to find whatever way you can. Be comfortable. I know that may sound counterintuitive. Be comfortable, be at ease. Try to be at ease with death. That's what's recommended in the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. There's a copy over there. I am called sometimes to be with people who are dying or with people who've recently died and to be with their families. And I follow the advice in that book, which is to the best that you can in those situations, you come in, and so we can do this to ourselves too, try to be our own friends and just be at ease. Be at ease, be friendly, be warm, and accept that this is what is happening or it has happened, and that then we're going to be with it in the most intimate and friendly way possible. I'll just end with saying that, as Tova said, people have various beliefs, both individual and cultural, about what may happen, or may say they don't know. I myself don't know what happens after death. And because I'm Buddhist, there are certain teachings. My best spiritual friend is on our altar here. His name was the most venerable Bhante Suhita Dharma. He was the most senior monk in North America at the time of his death because of cardiac arrest in December of 2013. He was the first African American to become a fully ordained bhikkhu or Buddhist monk. We were very, very good friends until he died. And he once told a group of those of us in the meditation hall with him in a meditation retreat in the wilderness in New Mexico, he looked around and he said, "I will always be with you." And people were like, "Ah." And then he said, "And when you least expect it." So I've always got to be ready for Bhante to appear in my life. And I do talk to him frequently.
Thank you. So I want to acknowledge that there's a lot of grief in the room right now. And I think when we look at our denial of death, what keeps us from acknowledging that we ourselves are going to die or facing the possible death, the possible or imminent death of those we love, grief can arise before we lose someone. It often does arise. There's a word for it. It's called anticipatory grief. And I don't know how we can live our lives without grieving. I mean, so I wanted to, before I talk, I just wanted to invite you to take a few moments to do a short guided meditation with you, if you're willing. And just be where you are right now in the room. And if you wish, you can close your eyes and take a few moments to think about a loss that either that you're experiencing right now or a loss that you've experienced recently. And it could be the loss of a person, but it could also be some other loss. It could be the loss of a job or a home or something less tangible, like a sense of safety. See if you can settle on something specific, a specific loss. And how has that loss impacted you physically? You noticed any changes in your body, in your appetite, your sleep patterns, your state of health? How has that loss impacted you emotionally? What feelings have arisen for you or arise for you now as you think about that loss? And how has that loss impacted you spiritually? Whatever that means to you. With whom have you spoken about that loss? And in what ways have you grieved? And when you're ready, you can come back to the room and open your eyes. I'll share a few words. So the first thing I want to say is that grief is a normal response to loss, and that's all kinds of loss. And as you've thought about the different losses in your life recently, they may include people, beloved pets, and home, or a job, or a state of mind that you feel it's elusive. Grief is a normal response, and there are both physical and emotional ways in which we experience grief. And I will invite you to, as I speak, see how this relates to your own experience, because each of us is unique. There are some common threads in how we all grieve, but each of us has our own ways of expressing grief, experiencing grief, and meeting grief in our lives. And I would say that there isn't anyone who can escape grief, and as we love people, as we love places, as we love experiences in our lives, there's always the element of loss that's lurking there in the background. We can't avoid it. And I think working with the 5 remembrances can just help us acknowledge that this is not, it's not specific to us. There's a story about a woman who lived in the time of the Buddha. Her name was Kisa Gotami. Some of you may know this story. And she lost her only child that she had wanted so badly, and her baby died, and she was walking around everywhere carrying her child, and someone told her to go and talk with the Buddha. And the Buddha gave her an assignment. He said, Kisa Gotami, knock on the doors of people in your village and ask them if they have lost anyone, and ask them for a mustard seed for each person in their family who's died. And she found that on every door she knocked, someone had died. And so she brought all these mustard seeds back to the Buddha, and in the process she realized, although she was so bereft, that she wasn't alone in her grief. And then she asked the Buddha if she could become ordained, if she could join the order of nuns, be a student of the Buddha. So her whole life changed after that. Not that following a spiritual path in that way is necessarily the way to deal, or certainly not the only way to deal with grief. But I think for her it was more the realizing how universal this experience was that was helpful to her. So sometimes it can be helpful for us when we're grieving to be in a space like this, or to be with other people who've lost loved ones, who can really understand, because often when we're grieving, we're in a kind of, I would say, almost an altered state, and that can go on for a while. So some of the physical signs of grief can be exhaustion, fatigue, just not having any energy, difficulty with sleep or insomnia, waking up in the middle of the night, not being able to fall asleep again, sometimes lack of appetite, or sometimes really being hungry, and difficulty in concentrating or remembering things. And we may not realize when we have those experiences that they're related to grief. You might wonder, well, what's wrong with me? Why can't I think straight? And we may not understand that that's connected to the grief that we're experiencing. Some emotional expressions of grief could be not only sadness, but also anxiety, worry. Are things going to be okay? Am I going to be okay? Anger. And the anger sometimes can be directed at oneself, like blaming oneself did I do something wrong? Is there something I could have done that I didn't do? Or it could be directed at the dying person or the person you're losing themselves. Or it could be directed at a doctor. Why couldn't that person do more to help my loved one? But anger is also a frequent expression of grief. Guilt, which I think goes with that thought, is there something I could have done that would have made a difference? And sometimes sudden emotional outbursts. You may think of yourself as someone who's really calm. And I think of this, one of my Buddhist teachers, when she learned that a very close friend of hers had a form of cancer that was quite severe and she had a few months left to live, she burst out with a scream, which was, just her pain about it. And it was not how she usually conducted herself, but it was just so genuine and real that the pain was just intense. So those are some of the emotional expressions of grief, and you may be familiar with some or all of them. And I think that there are some hospitals, I don't know how many, that have spaces where people can actually scream. They're called screaming rooms.
Really?
Yeah, I've heard of that.
Right.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
those feelings arise, and they're, it's helpful to have a place where you can express them. Certainly hospitals, many of them have chapels where you can go and be alone or be with others, but express your sadness, your grief. Maybe it's possible to scream in a chapel. I don't know. So I think I want to say just a few things about what can help when you're grieving. And I think one is some rituals. One thing I did after my mother died, a friend suggested this, I went to a beach and I wrote my mother's name in the sand, and the waves came in and gradually washed it away. And then I did it again, and I did it again. And I just watched her name being washed away, and it was for me, so comforting to realize that, her name was washed away, but somehow it helped me feel her presence still in a different form, perhaps. Or that, it was the act of writing it and then just watching it being washed away. We may find rituals in whatever spiritual tradition is important to us. I'm both Jewish and Buddhist, so there are many rituals in Judaism for dealing with grief and loss. When someone dies, there's a week in which people stay at home and friends bring food, and it's called sitting Shiva. And you don't work, you don't, you have time when people come, you can share memories of your loved one, and then for a month, people sometimes wear a piece of black cloth around their arm, and it's torn in a place. The cloth is torn as a symbol of that life being gone. Used to be people would tear their clothes, but now it's a piece of cloth. So whatever your spiritual tradition, in Buddhism we often do a memorial service when someone has just died, and then we may do one every week for 7 weeks, because there's a sense that 49 days is a significant period of time, and then often a yearly memorial. And I just want to mention a resource that's on the table. It's a booklet called When Blossoms Fall that some people at Zen Center and I put together. And it has readings, it has some ritual practices, and it has some resources for both practical and readings and websites that you might find helpful. So that's available. They're $10, and if you want to purchase one, I just wanted to mention that. Thank you.
Did you want to talk about Fran's tea cozy?
Oh, I did. Yes. Okay. So another way that something that can help with grieving is to have something that belonged to the person who died, and as a way of remembering them. And I had a friend named Fran who worked in India, and she would buy fabric in different places during the year, and when she went to India to do some work every year, she would have a shirt made. And after she died, her sister and a friend who were quilters made me a tea cozy with pieces of fabric. They took apart some of her shirts and made this tea cozy, and they made pot holders for other friends who were close to her. So I use this frequently. I like tea, and I think of Fran and remember her wearing these shirts, and it's just a way of remembering how adventurous she was, and she was herself a very creative person. And I went to see, maybe some of you saw, there was an exhibit of quilts at the Daylong some years ago, quilts from Gee's Bend in the south, Georgia maybe. And there were a number of women who made quilts from their husbands' work clothes. And there were quotes next to those quilts about how comforting they felt it was to sleep under these quilts made from their husbands' clothes. So, what's the word you have for this? I know you have a word for it.
Yeah, so I do a fair amount of interfaith work, and I found out from a Catholic priest that the Catholics have sacramentals, and they also recognize objects such as these as incidental sacramentals. So they recognize that they are sacramentals, and they're called incidental sacramentals. In my apartment, I still have, all these years later, since April 1996, the blue cotton shirt that my dad died in. Mm-hmm. I was the one who found his body, and I just quietly slipped his shirt after it was returned from to us by the funeral home guys. I just didn't even say anything to anyone. I just put it into my bag and I brought it home. And it's been there ever since. And every once in a while I take it out and I wear it.
Yeah, so there are things that can help us remember the people we love, which is another way of dealing with grief. Yeah. So over to you, Mushim.
Thank you, Tova. So something that I think I heard you say is that we can't escape grieving. Mm-hmm. And over lunch I was saying to Tova, who is older than I am, actually, so I just want to enjoy you every minute, Tova, that we can all go at any time. I'm 63 and a half, and that in this part of my life, it's getting so intense because I just know a lot more older people who I've known, as Tova said also, I've known for a really long time, who are dying. And that is natural, and it's also really hard when they cluster together. And there isn't enough time to really process and absorb. So that grieving is not only inevitable, it's in my understanding of the grief process, it's also trying to escape it is undesirable. Mm-hmm. Because what the theory was that my grief counselor shared with me, which I personally feel is true for myself, is that unless we get really good at grieving, we need some grief skills, folks, to be able to go towards grief in a way that feels okay and safe enough and really do the work. I mean, it is hard work. We've heard it said, your whole body can ache all over, and it's hard. It's not easy, not pleasant, and according to what Nancy, the grief counselor, told me, she said, unless we grieve every loss, no matter how seemingly small, as fully as we can, that the grieving that we haven't done for that loss kind of gets put underneath, like this zabuton, and it just lumps up and lumps up and lumps up until one day, she said, we have a huge pile of unresolved grief, and we think, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine, and suddenly we lose a pen or something that really is not a big deal, and we collapse, and all of that unresolved grief rises up as a giant glob of unresolved grief. And so to just keep processing as we go along, and to learn how to grieve, to learn how to let go, to learn how to feel the love that we have for beloved losses, and the happiness and the gratitude along with the devastation and the loneliness and the anger. Whew, a lot of work, and very good work. So grieving itself is a practice, that the better we become at it, really the better our lives will be. And so I immediately put this into action after I got this advice, and I've just been grieving away since April 1996. And for me, what form it takes is, I'm a pretty busy person. I'm an activist. I'm a Buddhist teacher. I work as a diversity and inclusion consultant, and so I'm really busy during the days. And then at night, sometimes I just recklessly stay up late, and I'll just sit on my bed and listen to music or think about the person and have all the thoughts, or maybe look at their photo. And so, because the night is quiet. It can be quiet and it feels very private to me. So that's often when I'm doing my most intense grieving. Is to just point out that grief takes its own damn time. It doesn't run on our time schedules. Like, oh yeah, all right, okay, friend died, 2 months. Hit my mark in 2 months. It really doesn't work like that. It can't be it's not time management. It is an altered state, I really definitely feel, and it's a timeless state. And so however long it takes is however long it takes. I read in one book on grief that the average length of time to grieve a major loss, such as the death of someone close to you, an animal companion that's very beloved, a divorce, the loss of a home, of a job that you really didn't want to let go of, just a really huge rupture in your life, the average time of grief is 3 to 5 years. Now that's an average, so that means for some people it's less, and for many people it's going to be more.
So may I interject something?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things you've probably heard is, aren't you over that yet?
Exactly. Yeah, which is one of the most hurtful things
It really is.
someone can say. I mean, like, no, I'm not.
Yeah. But people don't understand often if they have not either experienced a loss or they're not in touch with their own grief, and they can't bear it when they see someone else grieving. And
Yes.
so I just wanted to mention that, because it's a common thing that can be so hurtful when
It's
you're
very
grieving.
hurtful, yeah. Yeah, and because it makes people feel ashamed, like they should be able to just go on your normal life, right? And it's not. You don't have any normal life left after a major loss. You're in new territory. It's new ground. So grief takes its own time, and it can be more intense around birthdays, death dates, holidays, anniversaries, and other significant days. So my advice to myself is, again, to be proactive. Break out of denial. And if there's a major loss and we know that an anniversary of some sort is coming up, then mark it on your calendar and try to make some plans for yourself. If you can, take some time to do an extra walk, or to spend some quiet time, or to reach out to someone, whatever would be helpful and supportive to you. But plan ahead, because we know that those death dates or birth dates, holidays, can be very, very times when the grief increases in intensity. We'd also like to say that grief is expressed differently in different cultures. So it's not only personal, it's cultural, and that's been brought up and shared by some of you, and I'm really grateful for that. I remember the Screaming Rooms thing reminded me of, again, in an interfaith panel that I was on around death, grief, and loss some years ago, that a minister who was the chaplain for Alta Bates Hospital got a call at night from the hospital staff saying that there's a family here, their family member who's in the hospital died very unexpectedly, and they're screaming and they're crying, and one of the young men is slamming his fist into the wall, so we want to know, should we call security? And he said, absolutely not. If they're not harming themselves or anyone else, they are expressing normal grief and shock. Do not call security. I'm putting on my clothes. I'm going to be there as soon as I can. So to understand that, once again, grief is expressed quietly in some cultures, very noisily in other cultures. There can just be all these different cultural factors, so that there is a lot of diversity in how grief and grieving is expressed and processed. And the more that we learn about that and that we're open to trying on how someone may be expressing grief very differently than we recognize as the proper or the contained or the safe way to express grief, the more we're going to learn and the wider our hearts will open. Some years ago, there was an organization called University of Creation Spirituality on Broadway, and this kind of renegade priest, Matt Fox, he had, I think, just robed from being a Catholic priest, and however, he was an Episcopal priest, so he could give Mass within that tradition, and he put on a number of what they called cosmic masses. They were raves, basically, in the old historic Suites ballroom. And we'd heard they were really great. And so the next one was a mass for the divine masculine, and it was right around Father's Day. So we went in, and everyone there, or many people, seemed to kind of know what it was, because there were set pieces. And there was an opening, and it's very ritualized, and it did end with Mass for those who wish to partake. But there was one period fairly near the beginning which was called Lamentations. And that was when people were encouraged to vocally and with their bodies express the grief that they felt. There were people there who were waiting for that. Because the minute that there was announced, Lamentations, this scream went up, and people were screaming and crying and rolling on the floor, and it was just this amazing burst of energy which had been suppressed, all along, and was safely allowed to express itself in that space. And that went on for about 3 minutes, which seemed like a long time to have that full bore kind of screaming and lamenting, and then they rang a bell and boop, it was dead silent. And I've just never forgotten that, because how many opportunities do we have in our culture to lament if that's what we need to get out? So if that's what you need to do, try to go out and safely find some remote place where no one's going to be threatened or call security, and because that is natural. That is natural for many people in the human cycle. Could I just have one more minute?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to also end by saying that it is also normal in grieving to see and hear the person or being who has passed away, who has died. That is actually normal. Unless it interferes with your functioning in some way, it's completely normal. And I had mentioned to you that Bhante Suhita Dharma and I were really close friends. He was basically a member of my family. So he just dropped dead. I mean, what a great monk's death. Literally, he just dropped dead, boom, on his floor of his monastic room in a temple outside of Los Angeles, December of 2013. And then in 2014, just out of the blue, I received this email that said, "We would like to invite you to be one of 23 socially engaged Buddhist leaders from 5 urban areas in the United States who's invited by the Vatican, along with 23 socially engaged Catholic leaders, both monastic and lay from the United States, to come to Rome and have an interfaith dialogue for 5 days." And actually we ended up, even though we had never even dreamed this, at the 11th hour, someone pulled some strings, and we actually had a personal audience with Pope Francis. But anyway, this was from the Vatican, and they said, due to the passing of anti-corruption laws, which I thought, hey, that's great, we cannot cover your travel expenses, but once you get to Italy, and once you come into the airport, then all expenses are paid, and we'll take care of everything. So I was thinking, well, it was a lot of money, and I was just waffling, and I just thought, I don't know if I want to, because this is like very weird, and I don't even know the people who've invited me, and do they really know I'm from East Bay Meditation Center? I mean, we're a very kind of fringe kind of organization in some ways. And so I was just waffling here and waffling there, and suddenly Suhita Dharma appeared before me. I mean, just literally, just like Tova. It did not feel weird at all. He was standing right in front of me. He was wearing these clothes, which were kind of his casual monk's clothes, and he had these glasses, and he would just kind of like look owlishly through the glasses. And he just looked at me and he said 4 words. He said, "Mushim, you must go." So I said, okay. And I called the organizer and I said, "I'm coming." And when I went, by that time, as I said, at the 11th hour, we had somehow been invited to have a personal audience with His Holiness Pope Francis, and we were invited to each give him a gift of some sort. So he was given beautiful Buddha figures and special Catholic books and I don't know, all these treasures. And I thought, what could I give him, like See's candy? I mean, the guy does not need this. Really, I'm not going to spend a bunch of money on something that's just going to go to the depths of the Vatican. And so what I did was, when I met him, we shook hands, he took my hands, and I gave him a card with a photograph of Suhita Dharma so that he could complete his last journey to the Vatican, because he had been a Trappist monk before he was ordained as a Buddhist monk. And so Bhante was able to make his final journey and be received directly by the Pope.
That's a beautiful story. Thank you.